For months I'd been planning the perfect rehearsal dinner. I had the caterers booked, the flower arrangements finalized, and a guest list of 50 of my closest friends and family ready to celebrate my son Robert. Then I called my daughter-in-law, or as I thought of her, my son's fiancée, to confirm the final venue walkthrough. And that's when she dropped the bomb that shattered everything. "Oh, Janet, we got married yesterday. It was just a small thing at the courthouse. Hello, I'm Janet. I'm 62 years young, and I live in a lovely 3-bedroom colonial home in suburban Connecticut. I'm a recently retired high school guidance counselor. 35 years of navigating teenage drama certainly prepared me for some things, but apparently not this. I live alone now after my late husband Arthur passed away 5 years ago. He was the rock, the calm in my storm. And since then, my world has essentially revolved around my only child, my son Robert. Robert is 34, an incredibly bright, talented software engineer. He is everything to me. We've always been close, maybe too close, if you ask some people, but when you lose a spouse, your focus narrows. Robert met Mia, the woman in question, about 2 years ago. She's a sweet-looking girl, 31, works in marketing. On the surface, I liked her. She was polite, smart, and she seemed to make Robert happy. But from the start, there was a stiffness, a subtle barrier. I am the mother, the woman who raised Robert, and I expected a certain level of respect and inclusion, especially when it came to major life decisions. I envisioned myself as the matriarch, the centerpiece of their new family life. I saw Mia as a welcomed addition to our unit, not someone who would deliberately cut me out. Finding out about their secret wedding wasn't just a shock. It was a profound, stinging rejection of everything I thought I meant to my son. This whole situation has made me reevaluate every single choice I've made since Arthur left. My core issue, the true reason for my sensitivity, and this gut-wrenching feeling of betrayal stems from my childhood. I grew up in a household where I always felt peripheral. My mother was a classic narcissist. Everything revolved around her achievements, her needs, her approval. I spent my entire life feeling like a background character, never the star, never truly seen or prioritized. When I married Arthur, he changed that. He gave me validation, and he let me build the beautiful, stable, important life I always craved. When Robert was born, I poured all that yearning for connection and significance into him. I made sure he knew he was the center of my universe. That inherent fear of being excluded, of becoming irrelevant, has always simmered beneath the surface. It's my deepest vulnerability. Losing Arthur 5 years ago just ripped the bandage off that old wound. Suddenly, I was facing a life where I wasn't the primary focus of anyone's attention. I had poured 30 years into being a wife and a mother, and now my roles were diminishing. Robert was my last true connection to that sense of purpose. When Robert started dating Mia, I didn't just see a girlfriend. I saw the person who would either include me or isolate me. Every time Mia made a comment about doing things their own way, or when she gently steered Robert away from my suggestions about their future home, I didn't hear independence. I heard rejection. My hands would instinctively grip whatever I was holding. My face would tighten, the smile freezing, because inside that little girl, who was always overlooked, was screaming. I constantly checked my expressions in the mirror, trying to maintain a calm, pleasant facade, but my eyes often betrayed a flicker of anxiety. I'd catch myself rubbing my temples with my fingers, a nervous tic I developed when I felt things slipping out of my control. My body language was stiff, always poised, ready to defend my place in Robert's life. This secret marriage, it wasn't just a decision, it was proof to my deeply wounded psyche that I wasn't important. It confirmed my oldest, most toxic fear, that I am disposable, easily bypassed, and ultimately irrelevant to the people I love most. They didn't just exclude me from a ceremony. They executed a final, painful exclusion from Robert's most pivotal life moment. Before the bombshell of the secret wedding, My relationship with Mia was outwardly the picture of modern functional mother-in-law and daughter-in-law dynamics. There was no screaming, no obvious hostility. It was all smiles and careful, pleasant conversation. For the 2 years they dated, I made a concerted effort to be the cool Emiel. I read articles on setting boundaries. I tried to be helpful, but not intrusive, and I genuinely enjoyed the moments when we were all relaxed and laughing together. Mia and Robert would come over every Sunday for dinner. I always prepared Robert's favorites, my classic lasagna, or Arthur's famous pot roast. Those evenings, the atmosphere was usually light, often filled with joyful banter. Mia would sometimes bring a bottle of wine, and she'd often compliment my cooking, which always made me feel warm and appreciated. I remember one evening Robert was talking about a stressful work project, and Mia reached across the table to pat his arm, her face showing genuine concern. I watched them, feeling a gentle sense of Huan Hai delight, thinking, this is it. My family is growing, and she's a good influence. Mia and I even had a few outings together. We went to a small craft fair downtown one Saturday, and we spent 2 hours browsing antique jewelry. She bought me a delicate silver brooch, saying, "This reminds me of you, Janet, classic and elegant." My emotions were genuine. I felt seen and cherished in that moment. I often shared stories about Robert's childhood, and Mia listened attentively, her gaze soft and Ninaang gentle. I truly thought we were building a solid vui cheerful foundation based on mutual respect. I constantly reminded myself to be tumly considerate. If Mia looked tired, I'd offer her the guest room to nap. If they canceled a dinner, I'd respond with a breezy, "No problem, sweetie. We'll catch up later." I was determined not to be that mother-in-law. I was planning their grand wedding reception. I even let Mia pick the expensive imported linens, despite my personal preference for a local vendor. All these interactions, the easy laughter, the shared space, the wedding planning collaboration, created a veneer of hua-hop harmony. I truly believed that I was accepted, that I was a vital quantrong, important part of their upcoming life together. That's why the courthouse marriage, the ultimate act of exclusion after all this apparent goodwill, felt like a devastating, calculated blow. The moment I heard the words, "We got married yesterday," the entire reality I had carefully constructed shattered. I was standing in my kitchen, a list of floral options spread across the island counter. I remember my hand gripping the phone so tightly, my knuckles turned white. My first reaction wasn't immediate fury. It was an ice-cold realization of betrayal. I had fundamentally misunderstood everything. I genuinely believed the elaborate wedding planning we were involved in was a token of respect and affection. I had dedicated hundreds of hours and thousands of dollars to organizing a lavish reception for 50 guests, the beautiful traditional event I felt Robert deserved. Mia had been fully engaged, choosing colors, sampling cakes, sending me links to expensive bridal gowns. I truly thought she valued the traditional family dynamic and my involvement as a key figure. When she mentioned they got married at the courthouse, my mind immediately jumped to the only possible conclusion: they did this deliberately to shut me out. Why spend 6 months feigning enthusiasm for a grand celebration if she never intended to have one? The only logical answer, viewed through my lens of deep-seated fear of exclusion, was that she wanted to deny me my moment of maternal pride, my rightful place as the mother of the groom, and my opportunity to celebrate my son appropriately. Hearing the news, my face must have gone completely slack. My eyes felt wide and dry, fixed on the marble countertop. I couldn't articulate a single word for what felt like an eternity. The silence on the phone was suffocating. My body suddenly felt incredibly heavy, as if all my strength had been drained. I distinctly remember feeling a terrible wave of shame. How could I have been so utterly blind? I felt ridiculous, like a secondary character in a poorly written play. Mia quickly launched into an explanation about wanting to keep it simple and how the pressure of a big wedding was too much. As she spoke, my jaw tightened. My silent, bitter retort was too much stress, or too much of me. I saw this as a calculated lie. If simplicity was the goal, why allow me to book the expensive string quartet? My hands began to tremble slightly. I managed to ask in a voice that was unsettlingly calm, "And why did neither of you mention this to me before it happened, Mia?" Robert eventually got on the line and offered a weak, "Sorry, Mom, we just decided quickly." That statement was the sharpest blow. My own son, the one I lived for, couldn't even look me in the eye, figuratively speaking, when delivering this life-altering news. His lack of transparency, his spinelessness in letting Mia relay the message, confirmed my greatest fear. He chose her priority over mine, and he didn't respect me enough to be honest. My eyes welled up, but I aggressively fought back the tears. My expression solidified into a mask of cold disappointment. I folded my arms tightly across my chest, an instinctive defensive gesture to shield my immense vulnerability. The culmination of these emotions led to a burning defensive clarity. This was not merely about a wedding. It was a brazen power play. It was Mia clearly delineating boundaries and sending a message. "You are secondary now, Janet," and I absolutely refused to accept that. My confusion rapidly hardened into a cold, determined resolve. Due day, La Fanto, turning point, 800 to Bang Ting An. Phần này đã được viết ở các lượt trước, tôi xin phép lặp lại để giữ tính liên tục của kịch bản, vì bạn đã yêu cầu viết lại phần 5. 6 turning point, 800 words. The initial shock of the courthouse marriage announcement morphed into a quiet, simmering rage, but the actual turning point, the moment my perception irrevocably shifted and my emotional dam burst, happened 2 days later. I had insisted on a face-to-face dinner, calmly telling Robert and Mia, "We need to discuss the cancellation of the venue and the caterers." They reluctantly agreed to meet at my home on Tuesday evening. I served them Arthur's pot roast, the meal that always signified family and warmth. Robert looked miserable, avoiding my gaze, picking at his food. Mia, however, was disturbingly composed. She was dressed casually, wearing a new delicate gold chain. As we started discussing the logistics, her face was serene, almost annoyingly so. "So the florist deposit is non-refundable, Mia. That's $3,000. I stated, keeping my voice steady, though my hands were clenching in my lap under the table. Mia shrugged, a tiny dismissive movement of her shoulders. Her expression didn't change, no apology, no visible remorse. "Oh, well, Janet, it's just money. We can use it as a lesson learned about planning too far in advance." That phrase, "it's just money," hit me like a physical blow. That money represented Arthur's savings funds earmarked to give my only son the best start. But it wasn't the cost that triggered me. It was the sheer, breathtaking lack of empathy. It was the casual disrespect for my effort, my time, and my sacrifice. Then Robert spoke up, his eyes finally meeting mine, but only to defend her. "Mom, please don't make a big deal out of this. It's done. We are happy. And honestly, all the planning was getting a bit much anyway. Mia and I appreciate your intent, but we prefer simple." Appreciate my intent. The words echoed the condescension I felt from my own mother decades ago. I felt the heat rise in my chest, and my emotions went from cold disappointment to incandescent fury. I saw Mia gently touch Robert's arm, giving him a small conspiratorial smile. Her gaze lingered on me for a fraction of a second, and in that moment I read it. It wasn't relief. It was triumph. It was the look of a competitor who had just won the game. That's when the emotional explosion happened. I stood up so abruptly, the chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. My face must have been pale with shock and rage. I pointed a trembling finger at Mia. "You used me." I didn't shout. My voice was a low, dangerous growl. "You let me spend my late husband's money. You let me invest my heart and soul into creating something beautiful for Robert. And all along, you were planning to cut me out. This wasn't about being simple, Mia. This was about power. This was about teaching me a lesson. Wasn't it that I don't matter anymore? Tears, hot and angry, finally escaped my eyes and streamed down my cheeks. This wasn't just about the wedding. It was the confirmation of my life's deepest fear, that I was a fool easily discarded. My body language was rigid, shaking slightly with adrenaline. Mia flinched, her composure finally cracking. Robert looked horrified, trying to intervene. "Mom, that's unfair. Stop." But I couldn't stop. The years of quiet frustration, the fear of irrelevance, the pain of being overlooked by my own child, all coalesced into this single agonizing moment. I looked at Mia, her smug expression now replaced by a calculated defense, and I made a silent, concrete vow. You want to fight for power? Fine. You just forced me into a war I never wanted to fight, and I will protect my son and my legacy. The gentle Amiel was gone. Janet, the strategist, the one who navigated 3 decades of bureaucratic school politics, had just been activated. The moment Robert and Mia fled my house that Tuesday night, leaving my pot roast barely touched, and the air thick with unresolved fury, I didn't collapse. I moved. The tears dried almost instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Janet, the guidance counselor, the negotiator, the woman who had managed volatile parent-teacher conflicts, was now fully in control. I wasn't driven by petty revenge. I was driven by the need for justice, building a term I used internally to justify protecting my family's financial future from what I now perceived as Mia's opportunistic manipulation. My first act was immediate and strategic. I called David Chen, my late husband's estate lawyer, the very next morning. I didn't mince words. I told him about the secret wedding and my deep concern that Mia's actions indicated a pattern of disrespect and potential financial opportunism, especially given that Robert was set to inherit a substantial portion of Arthur's estate, which was currently managed in a trust. David, bless his meticulous soul, listened calmly. I didn't want to disinherit Robert, but I wanted to make the inheritance safe from a predator. David advised me to document everything, and I spent the entire week methodically compiling every email, text message, and receipt related to the failed wedding planning. This included the $3,000 florist deposit receipt Mia had dismissed as just money. I meticulously logged the dates of their Sunday dinners, noting Mia's superficial enthusiasm and Robert's increasingly withdrawn demeanor. My emotions during this process were complex. One moment I felt the anxiety of a spy, the next, the grim satisfaction of a prosecutor. I felt a surge of tension, but it was productive. It gave me focus. The second critical action involved their finances. Robert had a generous monthly allowance from a small fund Arthur had set up for him after graduating college. It wasn't life-sustaining, but it certainly paid his student loans and gave him extra spending cash. David helped me restructure that fund, immediately cutting financial access. I didn't cut it off completely. That would be too aggressive and look purely punitive. Instead, I reduced the amount by 70% and tied the release of the remaining 30% to meeting with me quarterly to discuss his financial health. This was done quietly, without telling Robert or Mia, to observe their reaction. The reaction came within a week. Robert called not angry, but sounding utterly confused and frantic. "Mom, what happened to the transfer? It's way short. Mia and I budgeted for that." His voice was shaky, injecting a small, dangerous dose of elation into my core. I kept my expression neutral on the phone. I explained very sweetly that I was consolidating some accounts and ensuring long-term security, adding, "It's just temporary, dear, but let's schedule a time to chat about your future financial planning." This move established me as the necessary gatekeeper, giving me back the control they had tried to steal. The final, most strategic move was the installation of security cameras. Robert and Mia frequently stayed at my house when they were visiting his old friends in the area. I had David draft a brief agreement for them to sign before their next stay, stating that due to recent incidents of petty theft in the neighborhood, I had installed a home security system that included cameras in the common areas, living room, hallway, kitchen. I assured Robert it was for my safety. In reality, these cameras were my insurance policy. I needed irrefutable evidence of any manipulative behavior, any unkind words spoken about me, or any casual misuse of my home while they were guests. The thought of catching Mia in a moment of unguarded rudeness filled me with a twisted sense of joyful and humorous anticipation. I felt powerful, like the entire conflict was now on my terms. I was prepared for their inevitable counterattack. Robert initially tried pleading, but Mia, seeing the financial noose tighten, shifted tactics instantly. She called me not to apologize, but with a voice dripping in false concern. "Janet, I'm truly worried about you. You've been behaving erratically since the wedding." The true counterstrike came 3 weeks later. I received a certified letter not from Robert, but from a lawyer I didn't recognize. The letter contained allegations that I was creating a hostile and psychologically damaging environment for Robert, citing my recent financial maneuvers and the sudden invasive installation of cameras. The letter ended with a chilling threat. They were considering petitioning the court for control over Robert's personal finances, arguing that my actions demonstrated I was unfit to manage the trust responsibly. My face flushed crimson as I read the phrase "unfit to manage the trust." This wasn't just about money. This was an attack on my competence and my reputation, the two things I valued most. They were attempting to frame me as mentally unstable, weaponizing my grief and my protective instincts. My eyes narrowed in furious disbelief. Mia was turning my careful defensive strategy into an offensive vulnerability. The next day, Robert called, sounding deeply rehearsed. He said Mia had convinced him to call a psychological consultant for me. "Mom, you need help. You're isolating yourself. The way you look when you talk about the wedding. Your expressions, it's like you're slipping away. We love you, but we're genuinely concerned about your emotional stability." The irony made my hands clench into painful fists. They were using my overt displays of emotion during the turning point as fabricated evidence against me. I looked at my own reflection in the hallway mirror. My face was rigid, my body tense with controlled indignation. They wanted to portray me as the volatile, manipulative mother, thereby directing the audience to hate or at least severely distrust my motives. They were attacking my credibility, suggesting my POV was unreliable because I was emotionally compromised. This was not a plea for peace. This was a calculated, vicious attempt to seize control of Robert's inheritance and permanently sideline me. Mia had escalated this from a domestic dispute into a legal and psychological war. She had underestimated Janet's resolve. I simply whispered, "Game on, Mia. You just made the biggest mistake of your married life." The moment the certified letter arrived, suggesting I was unfit and needed a psychological consultant, Mia sealed her fate. They had crossed the line from petty resentment to actual legal slander, attacking the very core of my identity. I immediately called David Chen, my lawyer, and instructed him to move aggressively. "They want a courtroom fine. I'm giving them one, but I'll be sitting at the head of the table." My final strike was executed precisely 2 weeks later during a mandated mediation session, a preliminary step before they could proceed with their motion to seize control of Robert's trust. The setting was sterile, a windowless conference room in David's law firm. Robert looked nervous, Mia looked confidently smug, and I walked in with an air of cold, unshakable composure, dressed impeccably. I wasn't just sitting across from them. I had David and a forensic accountant at my side, making my intentions clear immediately. David started by calmly dismantling their claims as baseless emotional retaliation for my prudent financial steps. But the real moment came when the accountant presented a meticulous report. The accountant revealed that within days of their secret courthouse marriage, Mia had taken out a substantial personal loan, using the expectation of Robert's impending full trust inheritance as a key piece of collateral. Furthermore, a deeper dive into their joint finances showed that Robert's recent reduced allowance, the money I had cut, was consistently being used to cover large, unscheduled payments on Mia's pre-existing credit card debt that accumulated long before they even met. The discovery was devastatingly clear. Mia hadn't married Robert for love alone. She had married him for immediate access to his expected wealth, intending to use the wedding funds I was preparing to pay off her personal liabilities. She saw me as an obstacle to be managed or failing that removed. Then came the emotional linchpin. David called in the final witness, my former assistant from the high school, Susan. Susan wasn't just a colleague. She was a mutual friend who had helped me with small wedding errands. She testified under oath that Mia had called her weeks before the courthouse event, not about flowers, but asking about the fastest way to get Robert's name on the deed of their newly purchased but financially precarious starter home. She told me, Susan said, looking directly at a pale, stunned Mia, that Robert was too sentimental about his mother's money and she needed control quickly. She said the big wedding was a tacky distraction and that Janet was too easy to manipulate with compliments. Mia's calculated expression finally shattered. Her face went from smug to white-hot fury, her eyes darting between me and the floor. Robert, completely blindsided, looked like he was going to vomit. His body language collapsed inward. He finally understood why I had been acting defensively. The truth was exposed not by my accusation, but by the cold, hard evidence and the testimony of an impartial third party. I didn't need to say a word. I simply looked at Robert, then back at Mia, my gaze hard and uncompromising. The silence was deafening, but it was a satisfying silence, the sound of an elaborate lie crumbling. Mia had attempted to play the victim and the strategist, but she fundamentally underestimated a mother's resolve and a retired guidance counselor's penchant for detailed record-keeping. My final move wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting my son from a calculated financial trap, achieving the ultimate undeniable validation. The mediation session ended not with a bang, but with a defeated whimper from Mia. Faced with irrefutable financial forensics and a credible unbiased witness, her lawyer quickly advised her to drop the claims of my supposed instability and financial incompetence. David Chen finalized the terms. Mia withdrew her petition, and the trust funds were immediately placed into an irrevocable structure accessible to Robert only under strict protective conditions. Effectively, I protected my liberty and Robert's inheritance. The immediate aftermath was a heavy silence. Robert walked out of the conference room a broken man. He didn't look at Mia. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame, confusion, and dawning realization. The truth had finally penetrated his naive defenses. As Mia stormed off, whispering bitter threats to her lawyer, I felt a deep, powerful sense of victory. This wasn't just winning a legal battle. It was the ultimate painful validation that my gut instinct, the fear that I was being systematically excluded and taken advantage of, was entirely correct. I didn't gloat. My emotions were complex, far from pure elation. There was a profound, wrenching sadness, the feeling of buon, vida nui de dukan, nhưng doi lai, la sufemboy sadness for having raised a child only to be met with betrayal. I looked at Robert and saw not the loving son I raised, but a man easily manipulated, a weak link in the family chain. The joy of victory was tempered by the bitter taste of disappointment in him. However, the dominant emotion was the feeling of Jingdang deserved triumph. I regained my life and my peace. I had spent 5 years post-Arthur walking on eggshells, terrified of being irrelevant, desperate to hold on to my role. By forcing this confrontation, I was finally freed from the performance. I was no longer the cool MIL, trying desperately to be accepted. I was Janet the matriarch, the protector and the ultimate decision-maker regarding the family legacy. That day, driving home, I didn't head straight back to my lonely colonial. I drove to the coast, parked, and just watched the waves crash. I took a deep cleansing breath. I started living for myself again. The wedding planning folder, once a symbol of hope and inclusion, was now a painful monument. I shredded it. I called the caterers and venues, and instead of fighting for the deposits, I told them to keep the money a tax I was willing to pay for my freedom and wisdom. My life shifted immediately. I started taking painting classes, something Arthur always encouraged, but I never made time for. I reconnected with old friends who I'd neglected while obsessing over Robert's relationship. The camp sucked at the feeling of satisfaction came from the internal knowledge that I had stood up for myself. I taught Mia a lesson she would never forget. And more importantly, I taught Robert a crucial, painful lesson about the cost of dishonesty and the danger of passive complicity. This was the moment of liberation. I was 62, and finally my own life was the main plot again, not just a supporting subplot in my son's drama. The glow of victory quickly faded, leaving behind the uncomfortable shadow of self-reflection. I was alone again in my quiet house, the silence amplifying my internal turmoil. I had won, but at what cost? My mind began a relentless cycle of self-interrogation. Was I right? Was I truly protecting Robert? Or was I simply feeding my own need for control and relevance? I walked into the living room, my body tired, my face heavy with weariness. I sank onto the sofa, running my hands over the velvet upholstery Arthur loved. The truth was, my actions, while justified by Mia's deceit, were also profoundly shaped by my decades-long fear of abandonment. My initial reaction to the secret wedding wasn't rational concern. It was the raw primal pain of a mother whose most significant role was abruptly ended without acknowledgement. I closed my eyes, reliving the intense fury of the confrontation, the emotional explosion when Mia dismissed the deposit as just money. Did I overreact? Could I have handled the financial situation with more grace, more subtlety, instead of immediately moving to cut the cord? Yes. I knew my sharp, sudden reduction in Robert's allowance was punitive, a knee-jerk defense mechanism designed to inflict the pain of loss that I myself was experiencing. I got up and walked to the window, staring out at the dusk. My expression in the glass was one of deep concentration, furrowed brows, showing the conflict raging within. I was right that Mia was manipulative and financially opportunistic. The evidence was irrefutable, but I also had to consciously acknowledge that my own insecurities had fueled the speed and severity of my response. I was right to expose the lie I told myself, feeling a momentary surge of righteous certainty. But I was wrong to allow my emotions to dictate the confrontation. My legal moves were sound, but the emotional cost to Robert was immense. I had humiliated him publicly, stripping away his naive trust in his new wife, and forcing him to confront the ugly truth of her motives. My hands went up to my temples, rubbing them slowly. This internal conflict was agonizing. I saw how my childhood wound, the fear of being unimportant, had made me hypervigilant and aggressive. Mia's secret wedding didn't just hurt me. It triggered a trauma response. My strategy. The camera's the lawyer. The evidence gathering was a professional, competent response to a threat. But it lacked the crucial element of maternal love and patience. I realized with a painful clarity that I had treated Robert like a case study, a victim to be rescued, rather than my adult son who deserved my honesty first, not my legal maneuverings. When Robert had asked about the reduced allowance, I lied about consolidating accounts, instead of simply saying, "I'm concerned about Mia's financial history and I need to protect your trust funds." The hardest part was realizing that my desire to win against Mia had momentarily overshadowed my desire to connect with Robert. My gaze dropped fixated on the floor. I saw the truth. I was a woman who was fiercely protective, strategic, and often correct, but also flawed, easily triggered, and fundamentally lonely. This victory hadn't cured the loneliness. It had just given me a more expensive version of it. The path forward wasn't just about protection. It was about repairing the collateral damage I had inflicted on my relationship with my son. The feeling was a deep, complex sorrow, the recognition that my emotional display during this conflict, though justified, had been driven by my deepest fears. The harsh reality of the legal victory forced a painful reckoning. I had secured Robert's financial future, but I had severely jeopardized our emotional connection. My growth began the morning after the mediation when Robert called. His voice was flat, devastated. He wasn't calling to yell. He was calling to ask me, "Mom, was any of it real? Did you ever trust me?" That was the decisive moment. My heart ached, and I knew I couldn't deploy another strategy or legal defense. I had to be a mother, not an attorney. The most painful lesson I learned was the difference between protecting and controlling. I realized I had been using the family trust and the planning for the large wedding as tools to maintain my status and centrality in Robert's life. When he chose to exclude me by the secret wedding, my reaction was not concern for his well-being, but outrage over my loss of significance. I learned that fear, my primal fear of being peripheral, makes you a poor communicator. I realized I never gave Mia a fair chance to build a relationship because I saw her immediately as a threat, a competitor for my son's attention. My protective actions, like the abrupt cuts to his allowance, were born out of fear and mistrust, not genuine open conversation. The intense emotional conditions of the last few months taught me that I needed to address the unresolved grief of losing Arthur, which I had unconsciously channeled into micromanaging Robert's life. I realized that my most significant mistake wasn't being right about Mia, but choosing litigation and covert surveillance. The cameras over honest, face-to-face communication with Robert about my concerns. My face finally softened as I accepted this hard truth. My first decision to improve the relationship was to be completely transparent with Robert. I invited him over without Mia, who was moving out after their swift, quiet annulment process began, and this time I didn't serve pot roast. I served coffee and the unvarnished truth. With my eyes fixed on his, I confessed, "Robert, I was right about Mia's motives, but I handled my fears terribly. When you had the secret wedding, I didn't see an adult decision. I saw my biggest fear coming true, that I was being shut out and replaced. My reaction was driven by my own pain, and I'm deeply sorry I broke your trust by being dishonest about the money and the cameras." The emotional requirement for this was immense. I had to swallow my pride and admit fault. I then established new respectful boundaries. I told him I would step back entirely from his financial life, except for the necessary administration of the trust handled solely through David. I handed him the keys to the camera system, telling him to uninstall it if he wished. Crucially, I made an unconditional commitment to him. From now on, I will only offer advice when you explicitly ask for it, and I will respect your decisions even if I disagree with them. My love for you is not tied to your need for my money or my approval. My body language was open hands flat on the table, showing I was offering peace, not plotting. However, my sudden intense pivot to total transparency and hands-off parenting was not without error. In my eagerness to correct my over-controlling past, I swung too far the other way. After the annulment, Robert was adrift, financially compromised due to the debt he shared with Mia, before the full truth emerged, and deeply cynical about his own judgment. He needed gentle guidance and emotional support, but I insisted on maintaining the respectful distance I had promised. I refused to check in feeling that any inquiry would be perceived as meddling. This error in decision-making was rooted in the emotional exhaustion from the fight. I lacked the energy to find the nuanced middle ground between control and support. I misinterpreted my promise to stop controlling his choices as a requirement to stop caring actively. I saw my face looking strained and distant in the mirror those weeks. When he confided in me about struggling to afford a new apartment instead of offering a temporary no-strings loan, I just offered the name of a financial advisor. My logic was I must adhere to the new boundary, but the effect was I abandoned him when he needed me most. This realization that I traded one form of emotional failure for another, substituting aggressive control with passive avoidance, was the final difficult piece of my growth. The mandatory condition was clear to truly heal. I had to learn that setting boundaries is about defining how you relate, not if you relate. I needed to find a way to offer support without judgment, combining the competence of Janet the strategist with the heart of Janet the mother. If there is one thing I want you, the viewer, especially those of you navigating the tricky terrain of in-law relationships in your 30s and beyond, to take away from my painful saga, it's this. The hardest battles you fight are rarely against the person across the table. They are against the ghosts of your own past. My story is a cautionary tale, delivered by a woman who learned the difference between protection and control the very hard way. First, let's talk about empathy. I was so focused on being right about Mia's financial deception that I became blind to Robert's reality. He wasn't malicious. He was just weak, naive, and afraid of confrontation. I forgot that empathy isn't about agreeing with someone's choices. It's about understanding the fear or need driving them. For me, empathy meant acknowledging that Robert's secret marriage was his clumsy, flawed attempt to assert his independence from an overbearing mother, me. If I had approached the conflict with curiosity and compassion, asking, "Why did you feel you couldn't tell me?" instead of immediately resorting to, "You betrayed me," the outcome might have been less destructive. My advice to you when tension rises, pause and ask yourself, what old wound is this triggering in me? And what fear is driving their reaction? Second, boundaries. This is the line where love ends and control begins. I believed my love for Robert gave me a permanent veto power over his life decisions, especially when money was involved. When I insisted on planning the grand reception, I was crossing Mia and Robert's boundary of personal choice. And when they had the secret wedding, they crossed my boundary of respect and communication. The key is setting clear, firm boundaries before the conflict explodes. Don't use money or emotional investment as leverage. I should have told Robert years ago, your inheritance is protected in a trust, and my role is purely administrative. Your marriage and life choices are yours alone. Instead, I let the ambiguity fester, which allowed Mia to exploit the gray areas and allowed me to become manipulative in my own defense. Boundaries aren't walls. They are guardrails that protect the integrity of both parties. Finally, and most crucially, communication. My biggest strategic failure wasn't hiring a lawyer. It was the failure to speak the truth plainly and early. When I first had doubts about Mia, I should have spoken to Robert not with accusations, but with facts and love. I'm worried about your financial security, and here is why. Instead, I used covert action, cutting the allowance, installing cameras, which completely eroded the foundation of trust. Communication must be direct, honest, and delivered in a moment of calm, not during an emotional meltdown. If you feel compelled to take drastic action like cutting funds or seeking legal advice, you must preface it with a difficult but necessary conversation. My victory felt deserved because I exposed a fraud. But my true liberation came from recognizing that I was also deeply flawed. To the American audience, remember your role as a parent or in-law is to be a loving consultant, not a controlling CEO. Let your adult children make their own mistakes. When you have to step in, use evidence and love, not just fear and anger. The health of the relationship is always more valuable than the satisfaction of being right. Learn from my years of pain and my ultimate costly victory. So that is my story. The day I asked about the wedding, and my daughter-in-law told me it was all over before it even began. It was a painful, expensive lesson that cost me a great deal of trust and peace, but it ultimately taught me how to be truly free. I won the legal battle, yes, but I'm still working on winning back my son's heart, and that is a much harder ongoing fight. What did you think of Mia's audacity? Have you ever faced such a cold-blooded betrayal from a family member you were trying to welcome? How would you have handled that moment when she casually dismissed $3,000 of my late husband's money? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm reading every single one, and trust me, I have plenty of time on my hands now that I'm only managing my life. If my story resonated with your own struggles, or if you appreciate the cold, hard lessons learned from the mother-in-law POV, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss my next video, where I reveal how I handled Robert's tearful plea to move back home after the annulment. Thank you for listening to my truth. Until next time, remember to choose communication over confrontation and always protect your peace.